This is the PocketBook Verse Pro, and it's probably the most capable true Kindle alternative you can get right now, because it's a lot more focused than Boox, while still being less ecosystem dependent than Kobo. It gives you a super compact 6-inch design and real hardware buttons, and now even built-in Libby support. Add audiobooks with sideloading support, a built-in ebook store, great battery life, and the best library management in the industry, and it almost sounds too good to be true. So let's take a close look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the PocketBook Verse Pro and jump right in. Now, the first thing that makes the Verse Pro stand out is its size. Because while a lot of the reader market has shifted toward slightly larger screens over the last few years, like the Kindle Paperwhite now having a 7-inch display, PocketBook kept the 6-inch display size of their competing high-end lineup alive. And I'm glad they did. It's a very compact little reader, and at around 181 grams, easy to hold. It's small enough to disappear in a jacket pocket, easy enough to hold in one hand, and light enough that longer reading sessions don't become a hand workout. It's comparable in size to a basic Kindle, but it feels nicer in the hand thanks to the better materials. The overall material choice is also a lot better than on older pocketbooks. The old soft touch material they used for years felt nice at first, but aged terribly. It got sticky over a couple of years, which was just awful. The Verse Pro thankfully drops that approach and uses smoother, harder plastic instead. Thank God. The back has a ribbed texture, which improves grip and should hold up better long term. This is also one of the few devices in this size class that still gives you physical buttons, actual hardware buttons, which for an e-reader still makes a lot of sense. Touchscreens are great for navigating interfaces. They're intuitive, they're flexible, but when you're actually reading, especially one-handed, touch is not always the most comfortable option if you ask me. And while the button design doesn't look that great at first, it's actually pretty smart. All 4 sit in one continuous bar below the screen, which sounds like it could be annoying to use blindly. But the 2 page turn buttons are slightly curved, while the outer buttons are flatter, so your fingers can distinguish them without looking. All of the buttons are also customizable. Short presses and long presses can be mapped to different functions, which adds a nice bit of flexibility. The button click is very tactile and maybe a tiny bit too loud, but it's easy to tell when you've actually pressed the button. But in a silent room, they're definitely more noticeable than I'd like. The screen is slightly recessed, which gives it a bit of a more old-school e-reader look compared to today's flatter display designs. Personally, I don't mind it here. It's not recessed very deeply, so it still looks modern enough, and that design also results in 2 practical advantages. It helps offset those relatively slim bezels a little, so it's harder to accidentally trigger the touchscreen while reading when holding the device there. And the bezel is matte, so there are no reflections. Build quality overall is good. It's fully plastic, yes, but it doesn't creak, it doesn't feel flimsy, and the chosen materials are relatively resistant to fingerprints and smudges, which is a practical benefit I always appreciate in an e-reader. So no complaints there. PocketBook also gives you IPX8 water resistance. The downside is that there's no microSD expansion here. You get 16 gigs of internal storage with roughly 12 gigs usable out of the box. And that's it. For most people, that's typically enough, but for a big audiobook collection, probably less so. So it's a trade-off. If you want water resistance, this is the model. If you want storage expansion, the regular non-Pro Verse is actually worth a look, but then you also give up the higher resolution display and the waterproofing. Speaking about the screen, the Verse Pro uses a 6-inch e-ink Carta panel with 300 ppi and a Frontlight with adjustable color temperature. Text looks crisp, contrast is very strong, and readability is excellent both with and without the Frontlight turned on. Even though the exact e-ink tech isn't mentioned, this looks very close to e-ink Carta 1300 with an L-star value of around 65 to 66 for the background brightness. The higher the number, the brighter the background appears. And this is on par with the best devices on the market. So in other words, it's a very comfortable display to read on. And the Frontlight is a bit mixed though. On the one hand, you get both cold white and warm orange LEDs, so you can shift the color temperature depending on the time of day or your personal preference. And brightness is good too. At around 90 nits on the cold setting, it easily gets bright enough to improve readability during the day, and on the warm setting it still reaches around 60 nits, which is absolutely fine for evening reading where you usually want less brightness anyway. More importantly, minimum brightness drops very low, around 0.17 nits, so even light-sensitive users should have no issues. The one weak point is uniformity. The lighting is okay, but there's a visible vertical brightness gradient from top to bottom, and if you're sensitive to Frontlight unevenness, you'll notice it. The good news is it becomes less obvious once you lower the brightness. So in the kind of dimmer settings many people actually use while reading, it's usually not a huge issue. Still, this is one of the Verse Pro's few flaws, if you prefer to use the Frontlight more often. Ghosting is typically well controlled. You can still spot a tiny bit of afterimage if you really look for it, because, well, it's e-ink. But it's minor and completely in line with what I'd expect from a modern Carta device. PocketBook also has one software feature here that I still really like, the lighting automation. Instead of relying on a light sensor, which can be a bit twitchy, PocketBook lets you automate both brightness and warm light through a time graph, so you can define exactly how the Frontlight should behave over the course of the day. That won't react to your room lighting, obviously, but it also won't get confused by every little lighting change around you. Now let's get to the software, because this is really where the Verse Pro turns from nice little e-reader into actual Anti-Kindle. And one of the biggest reasons for that now is Libby support. I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's not just that. So first, let's talk about the overall usability. PocketBook's interface has improved a lot over the years. It's now at a point where, in terms of general usability, I'd say it can absolutely keep up with Amazon and Kobo, and in a couple of areas it even goes beyond them. The first big thing is flexibility. You do not need to fully buy into an ecosystem here to use the device properly. In fact, if you skip Wi-Fi setup during the initial setup process, you can use the Verse Pro without an account entirely, unless of course you actually want to buy books or audiobooks from the integrated store. The latest software update also improved responsiveness of the user interface overall. Almost snappy at times, but it's still not as quick as Kindles or Kobos, and you'll still encounter the occasional sluggishness, especially when first triggering an action. It's most noticeable with certain apps like Libby or the browser, and with some smaller actions too when using them for the first time after waking up the device. I'd say that's maybe the biggest trade-off compared to the competition. I'd argue it's still okay for a reading first device though. Just keep it in mind. The home screen of the Verse Pro is pretty typical PocketBook. Up top you get your last books, below that recommendations from the integrated store, and at the bottom there are customizable shortcuts like library, audiobooks, shop, notes, and apps. And here's a very PocketBook detail that I genuinely appreciate. If you buy the device directly from PocketBook, those shop recommendations can be hidden. There's also a proper system-wide dark mode, and the quick settings in the notification dropdown are customizable too. But the real highlight is the library. PocketBook still has the best library management in the e-reading space. You can sort by author, genre, collections, favorites, folders, formats, opening date, edition date, title, and more. It supports normal directory structures, which helps a lot if you manage your files on a computer without additional software. But it also works really well with Calibre metadata and tagging systems, which is incredibly nice if you already have a curated ebook library and don't want to rebuild your organization from scratch just because you switched hardware. This is one of the biggest differences between a Kindle-style philosophy and the PocketBook philosophy. Kindle wants your content to flow through Amazon. PocketBook is much more willing to meet you where you already are. So that's a major advantage from a user perspective. What I also like about PocketBook's approach is that it gives you a lot of the openness people are often looking for in Android e-readers like Boox, but without the same amount of friction. Because yes, Boox devices are flexible, and that flexibility can be great, but they also come with more setup, more tweaking, and a steeper learning curve. So the experience feels less like a focused e-reader and more like a small e-ink tablet that you first have to shape into the device you want. The Verse Pro is much more straightforward than that. It's a zero distraction e-reader first. You get a proper built-in store, very strong library management, broad file support, and now Libby support too. So for a lot of people, it already covers the important stuff without asking them to build their own workflow first. And I'd also argue that installing Kindle or Kobo on a Boox doesn't automatically make that experience more independent. It can make it more convenient, sure, but you're still relying on the same ecosystems just through Android apps instead of dedicated hardware. The Verse Pro also supports both Adobe DRM and LCP DRM natively, making protected ebooks easy to use today while giving it a clear advantage over Boox's more app-dependent approach, Kobo's less flexible DRM handling, and Kindle's much more tightly controlled ecosystem. Now, to be fair, PocketBook also isn't the most frictionless option on day one if you're coming straight from Kindle. You can't just bring your Kindle books over natively unless you remove the DRM first. And that does make the shift away from Amazon a bit more painful at the beginning. But long term, if your goal is to actually regain independence, PocketBook's approach makes a lot of sense, because once you move toward open formats, sideloading, library borrowing, and a device that doesn't constantly funnel you back into one storefront, you're in a much healthier position. Inside Boox, the Verse Pro is also flexible. You can turn pages with touch, swipe, or buttons. Touch zones can be customized. Fonts, margins, line spacing, hyphenation, all of that can be adjusted. You can install your own fonts too, though text styling still isn't quite as granular as it is on Kobo. You can also hide some of the reading UI elements, page numbers, status bar, chapter countdown, or the dynamically calculated total page counts. PocketBook really lets you tune the reading experience quite a bit, and that fits the whole Anti-Kindle identity nicely. It feels like a device that wants to adapt to you, not the other way around. Annotations and notes are also handled fairly well overall. There's a simpler mode and a more advanced note mode. A long press on a word brings up a menu where you can highlight or add a note. And in the advanced mode, tools stay pinned at the top of the screen while you move through pages, which makes repeated highlighting or note-taking more frictionless. Notes can be exported as HTML. However, handwritten annotations don't fully export in the same way and are treated as references there, so it's also not perfect. One actual annoyance is highlighting larger portions of text with the cursors. It works well enough to be useful, but it's nowhere near as responsive as with Kindle or Kobo. So while the underlying organizational features for annotating are pretty good, the actual process of selecting more text can be frustrating at times. PocketBook offers a very broad range of downloadable dictionaries right from within the UI, and the grammatical word form recognition has improved compared to older generations. It's still not perfect, and depending on the language, it can miss forms or guess wrong. But overall, it's a good implementation that's easy to use. One old criticism of mine, though admittedly a bit nitpicky, still remains though. Opening a dictionary entry usually takes 2 steps. Tap the word, then choose dictionary. That doesn't sound like much, but if you look up words often, that extra step gets old. There is a dedicated dictionary mode to make that easier, which helps, but then you lose the convenience of quickly switching to other actions like notes. So it's workable, but not as elegant as it should be by now. Audio is an area where the Verse Pro is quietly much better than a Kindle. You can pair Bluetooth headphones or speakers and listen to audiobooks or music. There's no built-in speaker, which is a bit of a shame, but not a huge surprise on a compact device like this. What matters more is the freedom here. PocketBook separates music and audiobook playback into 2 different players, which makes the interface cleaner. But more importantly, you can sideload audiobooks from different sources instead of being pushed into one service like Audible. And yes, Audible support is missing, but I think that's a pretty small price to pay for not being locked into a single provider. You can buy through PocketBook's own store if you want convenience, or you can bring your own files. That's a much healthier approach. There's also text-to-speech with downloadable voices in different languages. They don't sound quite as clean as the voices you get on Boox through Android, but I'd argue they handle emphasis and sentence flow better when the text is heavily punctuated. So overall, they're perfectly usable for accessibility, language support, or simply having a book read aloud while you follow along. So let's listen to how that sounds.
"But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do not you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife, impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. This was invitation enough. Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England. That he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately. That he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week."
PDF handling is also surprisingly strong for a device in this class. In fact, among the mainstream non-Android e-reader brands, PocketBook is still the one I trust most with PDFs. But of course, this is still a 6-inch display. Large A4 or letter-sized PDFs are always going to be a compromise here. No software magic changes that, but PocketBook gives you proper tools to make the compromise more manageable. You get scrolling mode, single page mode, 2 and 3 column modes, reflow, zoom, margin cropping, landscape mode, and even image correction settings like gamma, brightness, and contrast. That's a lot of flexibility for a mainstream reader. In practice, that means you can do more with PDFs here than you probably expect from a little 6-inch device. But again, there's still a ceiling. For occasional PDFs, very nice. For living in academic papers all day, get something bigger. The integrated shop and cloud features are also well done. You can buy books and audiobooks over Wi-Fi, purchases sync nicely, Dropbox integration is available, and send to PocketBook by email still makes life easier. It's a very practical setup. The browser is also good for an e-reader browser, not on par with Android-based e-readers, and that's one of the applications where you'll notice the mentioned occasional sluggishness the most, but it's typically good enough for quick research, opening other ebook stores, or handling small tasks. Compared to Kindle and current Kobo devices, PocketBook gives one of the better browsing experiences in the mainstream reader world. And depending on your market, library lending is another strong advantage here as well. Because besides the mostly in German-speaking market supported Onleihe, PocketBook now supports Libby. For many users, Libby is one of the most practical and cost-effective ways to actually use an e-reader long-term. It means the Verse Pro is not just good at sideloading your own books or buying from a store, it's also a much better fit for people who primarily borrow books through the local library system. And that strengthens the anti-Kindle positioning of the PocketBook Verse Pro, because it pushes the e-reader further toward being an open, reader-first device, rather than one that mainly wants to sell you more content. For reading without the Frontlight, I measured a runtime of around 60 hours, which is good for this size segment. And even with the Frontlight set to 40 nits, which I often consider to be the sweet spot for comfortable reading on a Frontlit e-ink device, I still measured just over 40 hours on one charge. So where does this leave us? I'd say the one thing holding a PocketBook Verse Pro back from greatness is the sometimes sluggish user interface. To be fair, that would bother me much more on an Android e-ink device. But on a dedicated reading-first device, it arguably matters a bit less. Most of the time you open a book, turn pages, and keep reading. So while it's not great, it probably won't be a deal breaker for most people looking for a focused e-reader with a few useful extras. Because despite the sometimes slower user interface, PocketBook nailed the overall identity of the Verse Pro. It gives you proper sideloading, excellent library management, a lot of software features, customizable hardware buttons, Libby support, audio flexibility, and strong PDF handling in a focused low distraction package. Compared to the ad-free basic Kindle at 120 euros, the Verse Pro's 169 euros price is definitely a step up. But it's actually 10 euros cheaper than the Kindle Paperwhite, while still giving you the color temperature adjustable Frontlight, hardware buttons, nicer materials, and a format open, non-subsidized device. Like and subscribe if you found this review helpful. Thanks for spending your time watching, and I'll see you in the next one.